Hello everyone, welcome to the latest Repowering talk, and I'm delighted today to be introducing Liz Dunn from our planning team and Camilla Usher-Clark from our corporate team, and we're going to be talking about what the communities want and community ownerships in the context of repowering. Repowering is going to become increasingly important in the coming years as our existing assets, primarily wind to start with, but in due course solar, come offline. What are we going to do with those sites? Are we just going to allow them to lapse, or are we going to rebuild and repurpose them? If you look at what's needed for net zero, clearly repowering is very important. So welcome both of you. Thank you very much for doing this. First question, I suppose, and probably one for Liz, I think. From a consenting perspective, what do communities expect now? If you're looking at a repowering, they've obviously got used to an existing site. But if you're going to repower, I imagine it's going to be slightly different. What are the communities going to be expecting?
A good question. I think the communities are probably expecting something that looks very similar to what they have already. So they may well have got used to wind turbines, solar panels in a particular formation, I think with turbines at a particular height. So they'll be familiar with how that scheme operates. The reality of repowering, particularly for wind turbines, will be that the kinds of schemes we're seeing at the moment that will be coming up for repowering will have turbines of kind of 100, 110 metres to tip maybe. Okay. New projects are looking at around 200 metres to tip for new turbines. So repowering is going to be a replacement of a project. It's not just replacing the blades on the nacelle. It's new turbines, potentially in new locations. And so I think there is quite a potential for what communities expect and actually what repowered projects are going to look like. There is a mismatch. And so, it will be really important for projects that are looking at repowering to actually be doing engagement with their communities to explain not only what the sort of physical changes of those projects are going to be, but also what the greater benefits that will come from those projects, both in terms of energy generation. I mean, you're talking about sort of 2 to 3 megawatt turbines being replaced by 6 megawatt turbines, so massive increase in energy generation, but also then, as we'll come on to, what those community benefits or the sort of upside for communities may be as a result of them.
Okay, no, thanks very much. I suppose in a similar vein, Camilla, we've just heard there that this is going to be a different type project potentially in terms of the repowering. So from the community ownership perspective and participation in the project and the community benefit perspective, communities will have got used to what's happened in the past, but are they looking for something new and different now?
Potentially, yes. So as you've rightly identified, you've got community benefit and then potential community ownership in these sorts of projects. And if you wind back to when some of these projects first began, community ownership wasn't really on the cards. What was developed, and in a slightly ad hoc way back then, was community benefit. And so the developer would traditionally make an agreement with the community that they would pay an amount of money per megawatt for those projects. So what comes with repowering, we've wound on. There is now an incredibly sophisticated sort of precedent for community benefit. There's a sort of an accepted amount of money per megawatt that tends to be paid by developers. There is a range, but within a relatively small band, and there are some quite sophisticated organisations that are looking after these community benefit pots. So it's much easier for the developers to deal with the community benefit side. Okay. One of the upsides for the communities is if you're going to be putting 6 megawatt turbines on instead of 2 or 3 megawatt turbines, it might be these community benefit pots could be increasing substantially. But a lot of the communities themselves have got very used to this revenue and what it can do in their local environment. Community ownership is something quite different. So when these projects were first put up, community ownership wasn't really on the cards. Yeah. We used to have a number of conversations, didn't we, Liz, years ago with developers who would say to us, we want to do something for the community, what shall we do? And then in most cases, community benefit then went on to tick a box for them. Whereas now, Scottish Government policy, and arguably the Scottish Government has probably got the most advanced policy on this. They have a community ownership policy. So they like to see projects that are coming forward, looking at what they can do to enable the community to not just benefit, but to participate in those projects. And so we talk to developers about the different ways that they could achieve that. Welsh Government policy has taken a slightly different route, so they're looking at local ownership, which isn't necessarily restricted to the communities. It might be other parts of the supply chain or the landowners, and the take-up there perhaps hasn't been quite as good. English government policy has been a bit behind because we haven't had onshore wind, if we're talking about wind in England. So there is a big gap there at the moment, and if onshore wind is coming back, and if repowering opportunities come up, they're going to need to come up with a plan there. But in terms of the Scottish position, there's all sorts of ways that can be delivered, and we've been talking to some developers recently who are looking at new projects, as well as potential repowering opportunities, and exploring with them the different avenues and ways that could be delivered.
And I suppose what I forgot to ask at the beginning of all of this, and which becomes abundantly clear from what you both said, is it is absolutely vital to get the communities on side, isn't it? Yeah. In terms of getting the consenting, and then just for operation and general things around the project. I mean, if you don't have the communities on side,
you're starting from scratch.
You're starting from, and I'm presuming from the consenting perspective, it is incredibly difficult if that's the case, isn't it?
It is. I mean, we've got supported policy at the moment. I think across England, Wales, and Scotland around new renewables and new onshore wind. So it's a good place to be starting from. But that point around community support has been and remains a really important one. And I think for those, for developers who are looking at repowering, I think you've got to be careful not to take it for granted.
Yeah.
A lot of time and effort goes into engaging with communities, understanding, how they feel about projects. And if you've got a project where you've been able to maintain that contact with the communities, either because you've got a portfolio of schemes, so you're kind of well known and have got that name in the area as being, well, these guys are great because they do this and they support this and they come to this. That you can't underestimate how valuable that is. You may have it through your operations and maintenance contracts, where actually there are people who are kind of regularly at the site. So those types of projects, I think, will be starting from a better position. They'll know who the key people in the communities are. They'll know how people see the scheme. They'll know how important things like the community fund are. They'll have a sense of actually what the community are looking for that sort of next stage of the development. If you've got a project that's kind of been left and potentially had issues with enforcement from the council, complaints, those sorts of things, you're going to be starting from a very different position, which is potentially a community who have seen the least good side of your project, the less impressive side of the project, in terms of how things have worked, and may well, have actually built up quite a head of steam around objecting to a project. So I think it's really important that people looking at repowering projects don't take that community support for granted. And there's a great opportunity there if you can make those relationships, and it's never too late to make those relationships. So even if they haven't been there, getting out early, finding out how people sort of feel about the scheme. And then if you have got an opportunity to really engage with the community about, well, what is it they want next? You can set out the sort of the parameters of what you need to build. It's got to be this. The turbines are going to have to be this size because we just can't procure anything less. But how do we make it as good as we can for you? You're going to be starting from a really strong position.
So an interesting point that you say there, and it resonates with many of the other sessions we've been doing on repowering in the particular areas. And that is, whatever you do not take the fact that you've got an existing project there, or there has been an existing project there if you're a new developer coming to it, for granted
Yeah.
because it doesn't mean
Yeah.
that all will run smoothly at
Yeah.
all if you're not got that.
You're dealing with a whole new set of environmental constraints, just small things like what's your standoff from hedgerows for bats. It sounds really small, but the turbines that were put in 10, 20 years ago, 100-metre standoff may well have been enough. You're now talking about 200-metre turbines, bigger standoff. It's all those sorts of things that again, you can't just assume you're going to be going back to where you were before, because everything's developed in the meantime, and there will be additional constraints that you need to then take into account.
I think the other thing as well is, with the familiarity that some of these communities will have with those projects, they'll have got more comfortable with them. So from their demands might have changed. So saying sort of, okay, we'll same again then, you've had all this money, it's great. A lot of them may think, well, actually, I'm comfortable enough. I'd like to invest in this now,
Yes,
please. So
from
what's
the
your
investment
proposition?
side, yes,
Yeah.
Sweet.
So are you going to give us some equity in your project, or are
Yes.
you going to give us a proportion of the shared revenues, or can we have one of those turbines, please, for the community? So looking at all those options.
Does that mean that so if that is the case, the investors coming in, buying up projects, looking to finance projects, are they going to have to get their heads around much more of an issue around community ownership in these projects, do you think?
Potentially, yeah. So I mean, we're not seeing that many communities at the moment who are taking up ownership in these large scale projects. You still see a lot more sort of community owned projects. Where you do, it tends to be a share of the revenues rather than equity or ownership of a turbine, and actually splitting, because the legal issues around splitting a site and parceling off ownership of a turbine and shared grid and things, that can be quite complicated. But we are talking to some developers who want to establish, as you were saying, Liz, with a view to new projects and repowering, a sort of a model that they become known for, and they are recognising that those models from the ones 20, 15 years ago have moved on and will need to continue to evolve.
I think we're also seeing, particularly with Welsh Government and Scottish Government, that a much greater engagement in seeking that type of community ownership. So, as Camilla said, local ownership in the Welsh context, which is effectively ownership by a Welsh company, and Welsh Government set targets for local ownership, and the same in Scotland, where there's almost a policy position. It's a very interesting one, because actually no weight is given to it, but there's a kind of, you're creating an expectation for communities that there is something more than just a community fund. And actually there are a number of organisations setting up to say, we can help you to do this. So we talked about the expectation of communities. I think there is more knowledge and understanding, and perhaps going to be a greater push from communities to say, well, if we are going to have 200-metre tip turbines here, what is in it for us? It's been great we've had this revenue, but actually we're a bit more geared up to actually be able to take advantage of this. We understand how the system has worked better. You often get groups of people who've been involved in the administration of the community fund, who really kind of understand the economics of it much better. They understand the risk profile. So again, are much more clued up. The other side of things I think we're seeing a lot of is investment by other types of organisation, like pension funds and those sorts of things, where there's a greater confidence, I think, around that kind of individual investment in renewables now than there was, 10, 15 years ago.
That's great. Look, we're nearly out of time, but I suppose let's finish on top tips and key takeaways. I mean, obviously the takeaways, don't take it for granted, but any others you want to throw in there before we finish?
I think for me, it is the don't take it for granted, but it's get out and talk to the people in the communities, find out, and it can be hard. You hear things you don't want to hear, but actually setting that relationship again, really finding out what's going on and starting to talk to them about, look, there's a greater benefit here, there's an upside here, how do we work together on this scheme to take it forward? So, the sooner you can get on with those conversations, if they're not happening already, the better position you're going to be in.
And I think mine would be in preparation for those conversations and then post those conversations, just make sure you're going into them understanding how market practice has moved on and what the latest
Absolutely.
position is on community benefit and the potential for community ownership, local ownership, and how that might be delivered, so that you're armed when you get those questions from the community, you know how you're going to respond to them and you know where you're going to benchmark your offering. And then, you know, come and talk to us afterwards if they're placing demands on you and they're raising the prospect of pushing for some sort of ownership element, and you know, we can share our thoughts with you on the ways that could
And
be
talk
delivered.
through the models, I guess. Yeah.
Talk through the models.
Well, look, thank you both very much. It's a brilliant session, so thank you very much indeed. If you'd like to find out more or you're interested in anything we've been talking about today, then get hold of any of us via our website. The whole series of Repowering Talks is going to be on our website and also on our social channels. So thank you very much again. That's been great.
Thank you.